This ethos is three constituent elements to establish a normative theory of American politics so that we can ask these sorts of questions, right? Is what's happened democratic? Is what's happened in American politics, whether it's the Civil Rights Act of '64 or the Affordable Care Act or the Americans with Disabilities Act or whatever, is it consistent with democracy? Is it consistent with popular sovereignty? Does it pay respect to fundamental rights and liberties? Is it consistent with the concept of political equality? We want to divide that democratic ethos into three constituent elements: the element of popular sovereignty, the element of political equality, the element of fundamental rights and liberties. So first, we're going to talk here about popular sovereignty, right? Rule by the people. That's part of our political culture, we'll see, but it's also a great way to measure the quality of what goes on in American politics. Is what's going on in American politics reflective of the will of the people? And of course, we would say something a bit more specific than rule by the people. We would say, realistically, what does that mean? Rule by the majority. So what do we get then with the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65? We get legislation that has the support of a majority of the American people. They put pressure on members of Congress. They put pressure on the president. We get this legislation. So does America's second Reconstruction meet the standard of representing the will of the people? Indeed, it does. So by that measure, we would say that America's second Reconstruction is very much consistent with being democratic. It reflects the will of the majority. Political equality, the idea that every citizen has the opportunity to participate in the body politic. The Civil Rights Act of '64, I believe, promotes exactly this value. It does so by banning racial discrimination in the workplace and in public accommodations. It promotes a racial equality that in the South did not exist pre-1964, right? Because what we had across the South pre-1964 is Jim Crow, which is a denial of equality to African Americans. And then secondly, we would say, I think that the Voting Rights Act of '65 also promotes the value of political equality. It guarantees voting rights for African Americans in the South. That is quintessentially, right, what we mean when we say political equality. One person, one vote, as the Supreme Court put it back in the 1960s. So very clearly, the Voting Rights Act enhances this part of our body politic. It increases the quality of our democracy by validating, promoting, enhancing the value of political equality. Fundamental rights and liberties, enshrined, of course, in the U.S. Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, although those rights are really enshrined most critically in the first 8 amendments, to some extent in the 9th, and really not really hardly at all in the 10th. Be that as it may, I believe that the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Civil Rights Act of 64, both of these laws promote fundamental rights and liberties for African Americans across the American South. They promote freedom from racial discrimination, freedom from the denial of suffrage, guaranteed these rights by the federal government via federal legislation, enforcement by the executive branch, enforcement by the federal courts. That's something to take note of here really quickly. We'll come back to it a little bit later in the course. The Bill of Rights, great stuff, but really the Bill of Rights are all about negative liberties, right? All about government leaving people alone. Don't take away we the people's right to free speech. Government should not take away the right to keep and bear arms, and so forth. But I think this second Reconstruction, that epitomizes what we've come to know over time as positive liberties. Liberties, rights held by we the people that the federal government in particular can promote by actively intervening. This is really something that comes to us as early as Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, where he talks about freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom from homelessness, freedom from hunger. This is all part of this evolving concept of positive liberties that go beyond the Bill of Rights. And that's, I think, exactly what America's second Reconstruction is. It is an expression of positive liberty, right? The government stepping in, the federal government stepping in to guarantee for African Americans and all Americans freedom from racial discrimination, freedom from, I might add, sex discrimination in the workplace, in public accommodations, and of course guaranteeing the right to vote on the basis of race. Race cannot be used to deny suffrage after 1965. Politics. This will allow us to ask good questions about the quality of what goes on in American politics. Is what's going on consistent with popular sovereignty? Does it reflect the value of political equality? Is it consistent with fundamental rights and liberties? Right. So we can ask that about the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. I think affirmative on all counts there. We could ask it of other things that happen in American politics as well, right? What about the USA Patriot Act? Is that consistent with fundamental rights and liberties? Senator Rand has suggested that it is not, that it is an invasion of privacy, perhaps not consistent with the First Amendment, and so on and so forth. Is the Affordable Care Act consistent with the ethos of democracy? Some have argued that it is not, that it denies to many Americans their fundamental right and liberty to not get health insurance without paying a penalty to the federal government. So just about anything that goes on in American politics, anything really, right? We can always ask these sorts of good questions. Is it democratic? Does it enhance the quality of our democracy? Does it move us forward? Does it keep us status quo? Does it actually move us backwards? These are good normative questions to ask, and these are good ways to ask them. We're not going to perhaps often agree on the answers to these normative questions. Normative questions, I think, by their nature are pretty damned subjective. They admit of a range of possible answers. Right? Some believe passionately that the USA Patriot Act is fully democratic, is consistent with fundamental rights and liberties. Others believe just as passionately that it is not consistent with fundamental rights and liberties. See Senator Rand. So I think, however, this model, although it's not going to bring us to agreement, of course, on the quality of American politics, it does give us a common language, a common point of departure for debating just these sorts of normative questions. Is what's going on in American politics fully democratic? Is it consistent with popular sovereignty, consistent with political equality, consistent with fundamental rights and liberties?